Maseches Sukkah Daf Yud Gimel is commenting on the Mishnah, which it said you cannot use bundles of branches, stalks, or reeds to make a sukkah. The Gemara has a number of examples of different types of things that are bound up, which you are allowed to use, and Gemara will go through them. Along the way, it'll mention a halacha about what types of maror you're allowed to use for Pesach, what types of grasses you're allowed to use for paraduma stalks, how they have to be bound together, what's considered bound, what's not considered to be bound, and we'll also discuss yodos of foods, that is, stalks and stems, when they count as part of the food, as far as being metami them and being makabel tuma by being connected to food. So the Gemara is, first of all, on this list of things that you're allowed to use for schach and things you're not allowed to use for schach. So the Gemara, we're a few lines in on Daf Yud Gimel. The Gemara quotes Rav Gidon, the name of Rav, who says that afkusa dedikla you're allowed to use for schach. Now, afkusa dedikla Rashi defines as where you're first starting to grow a tree and you have many different stalks and branches spread out. So it's like a split, a whole group of shoots growing together out of the ground. So Gemara says you're allowed to use them even though they're connected to each other. It's not considered to be a connection which is a psul because it's connected mishamayim. Now the Gemara says the same thing applies if it's reeds, trees, reeds, the same thing. They both start with a whole bunch of stalks. They're connected. That connection is not a problem. Now the Gemara says you're even allowed to bind the ends together, meaning it's connected on one end, but it's loose at a bunch of different prongs on the other end. You're allowed to bind them together. And the reason is because binding one min all together as one does not count as binding something. In order to be bound, they have to have a bunch of different things bound together. Here you have one thing that's not considered to be a bound up object. So now the Gemara quotes a brisa to support that the same thing applies to reeds. And the brisa says that if you have reeds that grow in spikes in this way, you're allowed to use them for schach. The Gemara says, what's the chiddush? You're not allowed to use reeds. The Gemara says the chiddush is that you're allowed to bind them together even though they grow in many separate shoots and fronts. Now, this halacha was said over by Rav Chiz, the name of Ravina Bar Shila. The Gemara says that he also said over another halacha about using mar on Pesach. Said you're allowed to use mar called Merisa de Agma, which is mar which grows in the swamp. It's a different type of bitter herbs. You're allowed to use that for mar on Pesach. We have a kash on that, and that's we have a brisa talking about which types of grasses you're allowed to use to spray paraduma water on someone. And over there it says you're only allowed to use things that are called azov. Azov is the plant. You're not allowed to use something which has an additional name besides for azov, a specification of the name azov. So the brisa over there says that you're only allowed to use azov. You cannot use azov yavan, can't use Greek azov, and you're not allowed to use azov kuchli, azov midbari, wild azov, azov romi, Roman azov, and any type of azov that has another word in its name, you're not allowed to use. Where it says the same thing should apply over here, you should not be allowed to use any other type of mar. Only mar, not mar da'agam, not swamp mar. So Mar gives two answers. One answer is that this got its additional name after Matan Torah. It's only something which had additional name before Matan Torah that's excluded, because the Torah didn't say that plant with the additional name. It said only the regular plant, it excluded it. Here it didn't have a different name, and therefore at the time of Matan Torah, when the Torah was given, it included all types of mar. Later a differentiation was given, but it's all included in what the Torah says. The other answer, the Gemara here, the first one was Abaye, the second one is from Rava. He says that this plant is really just called mar. People tend to identify it by calling it swamp mar because it grows in the swamp, but it's not part of its name really. It's not what it is. Okay, now the Gemara discusses binding things together, which is what we've seen before. How many different types of things do you have to bind together for it to be considered to be an eged, for it to be considered a bound amount? Now, it's very important to know as far as halacha of schach or sukkah. It's also important to know as far as halacha of binding azovs together in order to spray paraduma water, because you have to take an eged, you have to take bound azov together. So there you have to take it. It's only kosher if you have something, if you have a minimum amount that's bound together. So Rav Chisda says one thing that's bound up is definitely not called bound. Three things definitely is called bound. Says Rav Chisda, if you have two things bound together, is that called an aguda? Is that called a binding? That's a machlokes tanaim. It's machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon. And the Gemara is going to analyze where we see this machlokes exactly in the Mishnah. The Gemara brings the Mishnah. The Mishnah says as follows. Quotes the Rabbanon and Rav Yossi. The Rabbanan say that to make proper Azov, you're supposed to take 3 stalks, and each stalk should have a big central leaf, which is how these Azovs grow. Now, Rav Yossi says that you should also take 3 stalks, but if some of them fell out, 2 have to remain. 2 is enough if you lost one, and if they broke and pieces fell off, as long as there's a little piece of each remaining, that's okay. So now the Gemara says, let's analyze this. If 2 are enough, if you lost one, 2 are enough, obviously all you really need is 2. So the main halacha is that you have to have 2. So why then does he say they have to have 3? So you don't have to have 3. The mitzvah is to have 3. So now Rav Yossi says that the mitzvah is to have 3, but it's kosher with 2. So when the Chachamim say that that you should have 3, they're obviously saying that you have to have 3. Otherwise, there's no machlokes between the two of them. So therefore, you see that the Rabbanon say that you have to have 3, and Rav Yossi says it's a mitzvah to have 3. You don't have to have 3. It's enough to have 2. So there, we're showing that it's a machlokes if 2 is enough or not. So the Gemara says there's a problem with this, because we have a brisa which quotes Rav Yossi very differently. This brisa quotes Rav Yossi, and it says as follows. He says, l'chadchila you have to have 3. He says clearly you have to have 3. It's not enough to have 2. If you have only 2, if you start with only 2, it's puzzle. Now, he says if you lost one, so if you are left with only 2, you started with 3, and you left with 2, that's kosher. But if you lost some and you left with only 1, that's puzzle. So you see here a few things. First of all, you see that even though you have to start with 3, if you're left with 2, it's kosher. So it's not true that the amount that you're left with when you lost some is the same amount which you have to start with. That's not true. And the second thing is he clearly says you have to have 3. You have to start with 3. If you start with 2, it's puzzle. So you can't tell me that that's what his machlokes is with the Rabbanon. Someone says, well, I'll still tell you that that's the machlokes. I'll just switch who says what. Rav Yossi says you have to have 3, and the Rabbanon say you're supposed to have 3, but it's kosher if you do not have 3. The Gemara says that, and so we've still established that still machlokes tanaim whether 2 stalks is considered to be a bound amount or not. So the Gemara says, and I'll support this with a brisa which clearly shows that this is true. The Rabbanon, it's quoting, so it says a halacha without a name. It's obviously the Rabbanon, doesn't say who's who. And this one says that if you start with 2, and you're left with only 1, that's kosher. That's obviously not Rav Yossi, because Rav Yossi said the opposite. He said that that's puzzle. And the brisa continues, so it says again, if you start with 2, or if you're left with 1, that's kosher. It's only puzzle if you start with 1 and you're left with 1. Which is left with 1 is puzzle. How could left with 1 be puzzle? You just told me left with 1 is kosher. I mean to say that you start with 1, which is the amount that I said that if you're left with, meaning you start with 1, you start with the same amount that you left with, which is 1. So being left with 1 is kosher, but you couldn't start with 1. You have to start with more than that. But either way, what we see from here is that the Rabbanan clearly hold that 2 is enough. So that is what the machlokes is between Rav Yossi and the Chachamim are. So again, we've established, if Chis is correct, there is a machlokes between Tanaim whether 2 is considered to be bound up or not. Okay, now the Gemara brings more examples of things which are usable or not usable for schach. Specifically if they're bound together. So Gemara says, Marimar said that bundles of branches that are bound together in order to be sold, you're allowed to use them for schach, because the only reason that they're bound together because they're sold that way. But when you buy them, you're going to take them home and spread them out. We're not afraid that you're going to make a sukkah out of it. Our original concern, the reason why we puzzled making a sukkah out of bound branches together is because you may put them there not l'shem sukkah, and then end up using it as a sukkah afterwards. You may put it on top of your shed or something to dry, and therefore you'll end up using it as a sukkah, even though you didn't put it there. You didn't put the schach on the top for that reason. But here, you don't have that problem, because the person who buys them always spreads them out. The only reason that they're bound together is to be sold that way, and therefore there's no concern you're going to end up making a sukkah out of them the way they are. Now, going further, the Gemara discusses a hiding shell that's constructed out of willow branches that's made by bird hunters. Bird hunters would make a little shell to hide, and they took branches and they spread them together. They tied them together on one end like a fan, meaning they were all tied together in one tight knot, and then they fanned out from there. The ends were tied together, they were woven together loosely with a rope that went around one and in at the other, in and out around them to hold them together. So you ended up with a large oval-shaped creation. All the branches met together at the top, and they were all spread out at the bottom, and they are woven loosely with a string that went all the way around them. So Gemara says, if you take off the binding at the top, it's kosher. Gemara says, but what about the binding at the bottom? So Gemara gives two explanations. Either the binding at the bottom has to be untied, but it's allowed to stay woven, or the binding at the bottom is not a problem because you can't carry it that way. It's too loosely woven to carry the bundle, so it doesn't really count as holding a bundle together. Okay, next halacha, the Gemara says, it's Abba and name of Shmuel, says 3 halachos about very light, flimsy vegetables. Which vegetables? Vegetables you're allowed to use for maror. What is the halacha? So these vegetables, they're wide and thin, but they dry up and they crumble up and waste away very quickly. Therefore, they have the following halacha. As far as hilchos tumah, we consider them very much l'chumrah. They do count as a roof. As far as bringing tumah from one object to another. If you have a piece of a mace under one of these leaves and some other object under the same leaf, it counts as a roof and it brings tumah through tumas awal. However, it doesn't block tumah. If it's on top of a tameh object and there's another object on top of it, so normally something which functions as a roof blocks tumah from rising through it if it is more than a tefach above the tumah itself. This thing is too flimsy, it doesn't block the tumah. So although it could act as a roof as far as bringing tumah to something under it, it does not act as a roof as far as blocking the tumah from rising to something above it. Now as far as the sukkah, generally the halacha is that pasul schach is only going to passel the whole sukkah if it's at least 4 tefachim wide. Here it passels if here it's a psul if it's 3 tefachim wide, and that's because it's so flimsy that it just counts as airspace. Now the Gemara moves on to discuss the halachos of a yad of certain fruits. Now yad means the following thing. Food is always mekabel toma, it's tomas ochlon. Now the stem or shell or something which you use to hold or handle the fruit, that is often mekabel tuma as well. Not only that, but it brings the tumah to and from the food, meaning to say if a tumah touches the stem or the shell, it's also metame the food, and it counts as part of the food. And the reason is because it serves the food. It's bottled to the food, and it's part of the food itself. Now, in a situation where you don't want the stem to be there, you'd rather get rid of it, it's not helpful. There, it's not bottled to the food because you want it to be gone, and it's not part of the food, it's not counted as part of the food, and doesn't bring tumah to the food itself. So, as far as the halacha of schach, food is puzzle for schach. So if the handles, if the yodais, the branches or the stems attached to food, is considered a yad and it's part of the food, then it'll be poslius for schach. Even though it's a branch, because it's part of food, you can't use it for schach. If, however, you have a situation in which the yad is not wanted as part of the food, you don't want it to be there, then it is not considered part of the food and it's kosher to be used for schach. So the Gemara talks about the stems of grapes and the stalks of wheat. And there's one statement by Rav Huna and one statement by Rav Menashe. So, one statement by Rav Abba in the name of Rav Huna, and one statement by Rav Menashe bar Gada in the name of Rav Huna. They're both in the name of Rav Huna. One is Rav Abba, one is Rav Menashe. So Rabbi Abba says that if somebody puts grapes with the stems on it into his vat that he's going to use to press wine, there he does not want the stems. The stems will mess up the wine, therefore it doesn't count as part of the grapes. It doesn't count as a yad. It's no good, and you don't want it to be there. It's not maybe tumah, it's not mekabel tumah. Rav Menashe talks about if you put grain on top of the sukkah. He says if you put grain on top of the sukkah, with stalks attached to it, so there you don't want the kernels to be attached to the stalks. You just want the stalks to serve as schach. You don't want the kernels to be there. Therefore, you don't want the kernels and the stalks to be attached to each other. Therefore, it does not serve as a yad. It doesn't count as a yad, and therefore it's not considered food. Therefore, it's not makabel tumah, and it is kosher schach. So the Gemara points out that Rav Menashe is going to agree to the grapes halacha of Rabbi Abba, but Rabbi Abba is not going to agree to the grain halacha of Rabbi Abba. What's the reason? Because Rabbi Abba's halacha is for sure logical. If you hold that the kernels Meaning to say, it's more logical that you want the kernels to stay together with the stalks than it is to say that you want the grapes together with the stems. The grapes and the stems you most definitely don't want. The stems are going to mess up the wine. So therefore, Rav Menashe would for sure agree that you don't want those stems on the grapes, and therefore they are not considered to be a yad. And Rav Abba, though, who said that, is not necessarily going to agree to Rav Menashe's halacha, because it could be you do want the kernels to be part of the stalks when you use them for schach, because that way they won't blow away. Stalks of wheat are very flimsy; they'll blow right off the top of the sukkah. You want the kernels to be attached to it in order that it should be heavier. That being the case, you do want them to be attached. It is a yad, and therefore it's now pasul schach, because you cannot use it anymore. Now the Gemara quotes a machlokes tanaim. The Gemara wants to know if there's a way to make this machlokes independent of this machlokes between Rav Menashe and Rabbi Abba. What's a machlokes tanaim? So Gemara quotes a brisa. The brisa says that all kinds of fruits on branches is a machlokes whether or not you're allowed to use them for schach or not. It talks about branches of fig trees with figs on them, branches of grapevines with grapes on them, branches, stalks of wheat with wheat on them, and branches of the date trees with fruit on them. So all these things. So the Tanakama says that as long as the fruit is on there, if it's majority fruit, it's pasul. If it's majority branches, it's kosher. Now, that argues on the other Tana here, which is called Acherim. Acherim says the stems of the fruit. That means to say there are three parts. There's the branch, there's the stem, and the fruit. The stem connects the branch to the fruit. The stems count as the fruit, and the branches have to be a majority over not only the fruit, but a majority over also the stem. That means, it sounds like, Acherim holds that there is a yad. The stems count as part of the fruit, and therefore the branches have to outnumber in volume also the stems. The Tanakama holds that there is no yad. The yad does not count at all, and therefore you don't have to outnumber it. Now, says, let's analyze this. You have your machokis between the Tanakama and Acherim. Tanakama says that there are yados here as far as Hilchos Sukkah are. The Tanakama says there are no yados as far as Hilchos Sukkah and Schach are concerned, and Acherim say that there are yados. Now, this Mishnah mentioned both grapes and stalks. Now, Rabbi Abba differentiated between grapes and stalks. He said that grapes do not have a yad and stalks do have a yad. So, how is he going to fit? Doesn't fit with either of these. So, what he's going to have to do is as follows. He's going to have to say that he holds like a cherem, and he does not fit in the Tanakama, because there's no way he could fit in the Tanakama. The Tanakama said that both the grapes and stalks do not have a yad. According to Rabbi Abba, the stalks should have a yad. There's no way to make those fit. The only way we could play around with this is to say that this wasn't really made for, wasn't originally harvested to use for schach, it was originally harvested to use as food. But whether it's originally harvested for schach or to use as food, either way, Rabbi Abba would say that you do have a yad. He even said that when you put it on the sukkah, you still have it as a yad, because you want the kernels to be attached to the stalks. So he should say that there is a yad. There's no way for the Tanakama to explain that it's not a yad. Whether you intended to use it for schach, Rabbi Abba would still say that it has a yad. And even if you did not intend to use it for schach, you intended to use it for food, so for sure you want the food attached to it, so then it should for sure be a yad. The Gemara explains that, it explains elsewhere that you need the stalks to be attached to the kernels if you're planning to use it for food, because you have to be able to shovel it around with a pitchfork, otherwise you can't handle it. It's very hard to handle. So Rabbi Abba therefore is not going to fit with the Tanakama at all. The only thing he can do is fit with Acherim, and he'll say that the grapes, I agree with him that to use it for schach, it has a yad. I'm just saying, when you want to make wine out of it, therefore it does not have a yad, because it messes things up. So therefore, Rabbi Abba has no way to get out of saying that the Chachamim are against him, and that the Machlokes Tanaim, he has to take one side of it.
The question is, what about Rav Menashe? Rav Menashe holds there are no yados for schach,
both for grain that have the stalks on them and for grapes that have the stems on them. Both do not count as yad when they're used as schach. Now that fits neatly into the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that there's no yad in this brisa. Question is, could they possibly fit with a cherem as well? Could Rav Menashe's opinion possibly fit with a cherem as well? Is it possible to say that as far as this case here, there is a yad, but for some reason they would agree to Rav Menashe that there's no yad in some circumstance? So the Gemara says yes. This case here, where there is a yad, is referring to where they originally cut the grapes and the stalks with intent to eat them, not to use them for schach, where they were going to use the whole thing for schach. And therefore, since it was food, they wanted the handles to be on the food, they wanted the grapes to be eaten, and therefore it had to have stems attached, so it was easier to handle. And they wanted the corn to be threshed, it had to have stems attached, so you could handle it with a pitchfork. Therefore, the yados were important, they wanted them to be attached, and therefore it has a yad. It is considered to be a significant yad, and it is mekabel tumah, it has the halacha of a yad. Now, that, then, you changed and decided to use it for schach, but it still stays a yad, and that's why here the achirim hold that there is a yad, and Rav Menashe would also agree to that in a case like that there is a yad. He was referring to where you originally cut the grapes or the wheat stalks for the purpose of schach, and in there achirim would agree that there's no yad. So Gemara says, if this is the situation, if this Mishnah is discussing where they were originally cut to be eaten, why would the Chachamim say that there's no yad? It was originally cut to be eaten, it certainly had a yad, why should there be no yad? So Gemara says, well, the obvious solution would be that the Chachamim hold that once you changed your mind and decided to use it for schach, now you no longer want the stalks and the stems to be attached, so now it doesn't count as a yad anymore. The Gemara says the problem with that is that you cannot change Hilchos Tumah based on deciding what you plan to use things for alone. You have to actually do something physical to change the halacha of Tumah. And the Gemara says we can see this halacha with the discussion of when a kli is considered to be finished, when it's considered to be completely formed, so that it is mekabel tumah. The halacha is that a kli that's in a process of being made is not finished yet. It's then considered to be scrap. It's not mekabel tumah, even if tumah touches it. However, once it's finished, once it's fully made and it's functional, then it is mekabel tumah. Now, sometimes a kli can have various stages of how made it is. You could finish smoothing it, and then maybe you plan to stain it, and you stain it, maybe you plan to varnish it. So it's really up to the worker, it's up to the artisan who's making each particular kli to decide when it's finished. Now, if you decide that a kli is finished, from then on it's mekabel tumah. In order to get it out of being mekabel tumah by saying, you know what, I plan to do more work, you have to actually start doing more work. In order to take off the halacha that it's already mekabel tumah, you have to actually do more work. You cannot just think, oh, I'm planning to do more work on this thing. You have to actually do a physical action. Thoughts do not change the halacha. It doesn't take it out of the state of being mekabel tumah. So the same thing should apply here. The Chachamim should have to say, listen, if you originally cut these fruits, these grapes and these grain, in order to eat, and therefore it has a yad, you cannot get rid of the yad by saying, no, I plan to use it for schach. So why would the Chachamim say that it has no yad? So the Gemara says, well, maybe there's a difference between yados and actual kelim themselves. As far as a kli, since it's a chash of a kli, it has a status of being a finished made object. So there, you cannot unmake it from being a kli by deciding you want to do more work on it. But here, as far as the yad is just a piece of scrap. So something like that. So if you originally cut the fruits in order to eat it, so it has the halachic status of yad, and it's mekabel tumah, and it's mevias tumah. But if you want to decide that it's just a piece of trash, so you just have to decide, okay, I decide I'm using it for something else, I'm using it for schach now, I don't need the yad anymore. It's not so chashiv, so therefore it's easier to take off the status of usefulness from it. The Gemara says that would be nice. The problem is that we have a Mishnah which discusses how you take off the status of a yad, and the Mishnah is referring to where you have grain on the threshing floor that has the stalks attached to it, and it says Zamachlekes Tanaim what you have to do to take the status of yad off the stalks. And according to the Chachamim there, you have to do what's called shebasasan. You have to do that. So the Gemara says we have Machlokes Amoraim what Shabbosason means. Now, according to the opinion that Shabbosason means that you actually have to go ahead and crush them. So you see, you have to do a Maisa. You have to do an actual action, right? This opinion holds Shabbosason means you crush them, you smash up the stalks until they become useless. So then you have to actually do an action to go ahead and take off the status of Yad and show that I don't want this Yad anymore. So that means that Yad is just the same as a Kli. You have to do a physical action to take off the status of Yad to make it not an important Yad anymore. And therefore it would make sense what the Chacham hold over here. In our case, why couldn't I just decide I want to use these stalks and stems and fruits for schach now, and therefore it's not considered a Yad anymore? That wouldn't make sense. Now there is another opinion there that says that Shabbosason just means that I untie them and I leave them strewn around the threshing floor. That shows that I don't need them anymore. I don't need them to be tied up. Because I was using the stems to hold them together with a rope. I don't need that anymore because I opened the rope. So according to that opinion, that's not really an action. You didn't do anything physical to it. You just indicated that you've changed your mind. So that's a mental thing. So then, okay, with that approach, I could understand. The Rabbanan here would say as soon as you decide you want to use it for schach, the Yad is not a Yad anymore. But according to the opinion, you have to actually crush it. How would it make sense? So the Gemara says very simple. We're talking about a case where you went ahead and you did Shabbosason. You crushed it, you beat it up, and you broke off the stalks. It says you beat it up, you broke off the stalks. So then it's very clear why the Chachamim would say it's not a Yad anymore. You did an action to show you don't want the Yad attached to the fruits anymore. But what would Acherim hold? How come Acherim would say that no, it still has the status of a Yad? I physically went ahead and crushed them off. So Gemara says, well, if you look in the Mishnah that you quoted about Shabbosason, there's another opinion there. There's Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says is that even if you did Shabbosason, it still has the halach of a Yad. So Acherim holds like Rabbi Yossi. So Gemara says, well, you can't just say that. You have to see what Rabbi Yossi's logic is. Rabbi Yossi's logic is that even after Shabbosason, there are still stubs of stem left, and it's still easier to handle this way. You could still handle it with a pitchfork that you couldn't handle it before. But as far as you, when you're discussing schach, you don't need a pitchfork to handle it. So that wouldn't make any sense. Rabbi Yossi's opinion wouldn't hold true in this case. He was talking about on the threshing floor. You were referring to when you use it for schach. Acherim couldn't possibly use Rabbi Yossi's opinion and say it still has the significance of a Yad then. So Gemara says, no. Even Rabbi Yossi, even in Acherim's case where it's being used for schach, they still have a similar approach to Rabbi Yossi. It's easier to grab. It's easier for you to hold on to it. You could hold it by the stem, and therefore you do, to a certain extent, want the stem to be on it, and therefore that explains what the machlokes is. So it comes out that we are discussing a case, at least Rav Menashe would say we are discussing a case where it was originally cut or harvested to be used as food, and therefore it counted as a Yad. Then you went ahead and you cracked off the stems, you broke them off. The Chachamim say, therefore, you did an action and showed that it does not have, there is no need for the Yad anymore, and therefore the Yad does not count, it's no longer a Yad. And therefore, you only have to have enough branch to be Mevatel the Yad, to be Mevatel the fruit, not to be Mevatel the Yad, but Acherim hold, no, the Yad is still useful, you still need to be able to handle it, and therefore you have to have enough branch to be able to be Mevatel the fruit and the Yad, which are both Pasul Schach, because they're Makabel Tumah.